Welcome to Lesson 3 of Introduction to Python. In today's lesson, we'll be covering over two main topics, lists and loops. We'll be going over some of the commands that lists can do and over two main loops. So what are lists? Python lists are sequences of comma-separated items. Each one of these items works just like a variable does. There can be any value that can be in a variable. For example, we have two strings here and two integers. Although this is the example, we can also have Boolean values or floats. We should note that in one list we can have multiple different types. Lists have a really cool feature called indexing. So for a list with indexes, we can see that we can assign each one of the values into a list with a number, starting at 0. For example, this is a list full of only integers. So the values are these because these are the values in the integers, but for the actual indexes, we will assign the values of numbers. In this case, and this case only, the indexes match the values. For example, since we start from 0 for indexing, we will assign the value of 0 to index 0, and then the value of 1 to index 1. So on and so forth until the value of 5 to index 5. To find an index, we can simply put the list name, a bracket, the index that we want, and then an ending bracket. In this case, the value at index 0 is 0. Another example is that the value at index 3 is equal to 3. We should remember that the index is the position that it is at, and it always starts from 0. The value is the actual value at the index. If we assign an index to every value in a list, we can change one value in the list at a time. For example, modifying a list is done by adding the list name and then in brackets the index of the value you want to modify, and then we can assign it to a new value just like we're assigning a variable. Let's look at this example. We have my list again, and if we find the value at index 2, we can see that we have hi being index 0, by being index 1, 1 being at index 2, and then 2 being at index 3. So my list 2 would be the value at index 2, which is equal to 1. And since we're assigning it to hello, we can reassign the value of 1 to hello. What this means is that if we print out my list here, we can see we have the original my list being hi, by, 1, and 2. But once we reassign the value at index 2 to hello, we get hi, by, hello, 2. Since there are different values in lists, sometimes we need to find if a value is in a list. So Python has an operation called in. In basically determines whether or not an object is in the list. In has two values, true or false, depending on whether or not the object is in the list. So here we have the same list, but with a different example. We have print hi in my list. So this will either return true if hi is in my list, or false if hi is not in my list. Well, let's look. At index 0, we have hi, and therefore hi is in my list because this value and this value are the same. So this would print out true. However, if we ask for 3 in my list, we will see that at index 0, we have hi, index 1, we have by, index 2, we have 1, index 3, we have 2, and then the list is over, meaning that 3 is not in my list. Therefore, this prints out false. We can also add things to our list one at a time. This is called appending. Appending automatically adds the value at the end of the list. So if we append the value of hello, we keep these original values in my list, but after appending this value, we can see that if we print it out, we get our original list plus hello. We can also remove, and there are two main ways to remove an item from a list. We can do our list name .remove, and then this removes the item by the value, or we can do del list name by the index. This is important because sometimes if you only know the index or you only know the value, you have to either remove if you know the value or delete if you only know the index. Now let's find an example of this. We have my list, and if we remove 2, remember that 2 removes the object with the value. So we can see that the value at index 2 has the value of 1. Therefore, we would remove 1 from the list. Range is another thing that Python can do. What range does is that it takes in around 3 numbers and then it creates a list of integers within the range. So the 3 main parameters of range are the starting number, which is the first number, the stopping number, which actually is the ending number plus 1 because you don't actually have the stopping number, and then the steps. Let's look at an example to better understand this. We have x equals range 0, 10, 1. So 0 is the starting number, 10 is the stopping number, and then step is the amount we increment by. Here we can see that we start at 0, and then we keep going until we reach 10, where we don't print out 10. And then each number increments by 1 because our step is 1. But as we can see here, the last parameter of step is automatically set to 1. So unless we're going to count by 2's, we don't need this. As you can see, we can simply put the starting number and the stopping number, and we would get the exact same. In addition, we can also omit the first parameter of 0 because the automatic starting number is 0. So for these 2 parameters, unless we want to pick a different number to start with or change the step number, for range all we need to do is provide the stopping number. Now let's move on to the second part of the lesson, which is loops. A Python loop is a statement that executes a block of code repeatedly. There are 2 types of loops we're going to go on about, the for loop and the while loop. The for loop executes a block of code a certain amount of times. So the syntax for this we will go over, but let's say I want to print out all of the numbers from 0 to 5. Now, I could directly print them out, but why not just have a program that will directly be able to print them out in like 3 or 2 lines? Well, that's what the for loop is for. The syntax for loop is explained here. So, as in the name, we have a for, and then I. I represents an iterator, which is basically you can think about it as the current loop number that we are on that starts with 0. So let's just say I am on loop number 1 and I have already looped once. Therefore, we have for I in range and then the amount of times it runs. And then we will, if we print the value of the iterator, we can see that we print first we are on loop 0, then on loop 1, then 2, 3, 4, and 5. Again, since most things in Python will start with 0, the amount of times it runs will be the number 1 greater than the number that we stop at. So inside these parentheses, there are 3 values possible. We can put the starting number, which is automatically set as 0, the ending number, which in this case is 6, and then the incrementation, which just like in range, as we mentioned earlier, ends and is typically 1. So, if we wanted to print all the numbers from 0 to 5, we can use a for loop. This for loop, printing out the incrementations, if we put 6 here, 6 is the maximum value that we cannot print, so we would print all the numbers from 0 to 5. Another way to do this is to combine for loops and lists. We have the iterator, again, but instead of going in range, we can go into a certain list. So as we can see in this example here, we have the list equals all of the numbers from 0 to 5. If we go I in list, instead of being an iterator, we have I being the value of the current item in the list. This will run for the length of the list, with I being each and every one of these values. So if we print I, it would be the value of 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. And as you can see, it still prints out the same thing. The second main loop we have is the while loop. A while loop is interesting because it goes on a certain amount of unpredictable times until a certain condition is executed. So this condition can only be true or false, and until this condition is false, it will keep running. As we can see in the example, we have counter equals 0, sum is 0, and while counter is less than 10, we will print it. So in each time, we need to make sure to at least increment counter, otherwise this while loop will run forever. And then we can see here that sum is sum plus counter. At the very end, we print sum. So we can see we have counter being 0 and then all the way to 9 because its while counter is less than 10. And at the very end, sum is the value of all of these counters plus the initial value of sum, which was 0. So it's simply the values of 1 added up to 9, which is 55. Two things that are just as important are break and continuing. Break says that once this line of code is executed, then it will break the loop and end the loop. So even though this says for I in range 100, as soon as I is greater than 5, we can see that it will break the loop. So here, after 5, nothing is printed because the loop has been broken and we don't run it anymore. Continue is like the opposite of break. Nothing happens. So here we have if count mod 2 is equal to 1, then it just simply continues on and does nothing. As you can see, the loop runs its full course. Now it's time for examples and problems. What does this print? Well, let's go over it. We have count equals 0, and while count is less than 10, we increment count by 1, and if count is 11, we print high. But if count is 2, we print by. So count can go all the way from 0 to 9, because as soon as count is greater than 10, then it exits the while loop, meaning that count will never reach 11, which is a number greater than 10. Therefore, we will never print high. But on the third incrementation of the while loop, when count is equal to 2, we will be able to print by. Thus, this program prints by. Let's try one more example. Try actually printing it out and running it yourself. So we can see here that the value of the list is 3 strings, 1, 2, and 3. If we reassign the value of list with the index 1 as 4, we would get 1 at index 0, 2 at index 1, and 3 at index 2. But since we've reassigned the value at index 1 to 4, we reassign the value of 2 to 4 and thus get 1, 4, 3.